In 1947, Andy Dufresne, Tim Robbins, a financier in Maine, is sentenced for killing his better half and her darling, a golf master. Since the province of Maine has no capital punishment, he is given 2 successive life sentences and shipped off the famously cruel Shawshank jail. Andy continues to guarantee his guiltlessness, however his cold and ascertaining disposition persuades everybody to think he made it happen. In the meantime, Ellis Boyd Redding, Morgan Freeman, known as Red, is being consulted for parole in the wake of having burned through 20 years at Shawshank for homicide. In spite of his earnest attempts and conduct, Red's parole is dismissed, which doesn't stage him so much. Red is then presented as the nearby dealer who can get prisoners anything they need, sensibly speaking. A caution goes off alarming all detainees of fresh debuts. Red and his companions bet on whichever new fish will have an anxious separate during his most memorable night in jail. Red puts down a tremendous bet on Andy. During the principal night, an overweight recently shown up prisoner, nicknamed Fat Ass, separates and cries insanely, permitting Haywood, William Sadler, to win the bet. In any case, the festival is brief when the main watchman, Baron Headley, Clancy Brown, viciously thrashes the chunky person for not keeping calm when he is asked to. In the interim, Andy stays enduring and made. The following morning, the detainees discover that Fat Ass kicked the bucket in the clinic in light of the fact that the jail specialist had been out for the evening. Andy asks about the man's name just to get put somewhere around Haywood. About a month after the fact, Andy approaches Red, having known about his gifts for tracking down things. He requests that Red find him a stone mallet, an instrument he guarantees is vital for his side interest of rock gathering and chiseling. Red poses a couple of inquiries about his goals, which Andy dismisses. Red consents to put in the request and furthermore cautions Andy about the Sisters, a gathering of detainees who physically attacks different detainees, in particular their chief, Boggs, Imprint Ralston, who has eyes for Andy. However different detainees think about Andy, a truly unfeeling person, Red sees something in Andy, and preferences him all along. Red thinks Andy plans to utilize the mallet to design a getaway later on, however when he at last sees the apparatus' genuine size, he comprehends the reason why Andy snickered and chuckles as well, setting to the side the prospect that Andy might at any point utilize it to get out from underneath jail. During the initial 2 years of his detainment, Andy invests a large portion of his energy working in the jail clothing or warding off Boggs and the Sisters. However, he tenaciously opposes and battles them like clockwork. Andy is beaten and assaulted consistently yet stays silent about it. At the point when a work detail for tarring the top of one of the jail's structures is declared, Red makes some things happen to get Andy and a couple of their shared companions doled out to the gig, offering everybody a reprieve from the standard thing. During the gig, Andy hears Headley griping about paying expenses for an impending legacy. Drawing from his mastery as a broker, Andy tells Headley how he can protect his cash from the IRS by transforming it into a one-time gift for his significant other. He then offers to help Headley in finishing up the administrative work in return for a few cold brews for his kindred detainees while on the tarring position. Headley first takes steps to lose Andy the rooftop, however in the end concurs and do furnish the functioning prisoners with cold lagers before the gig is done. Red comments that Andy might have designed the honor to construct favor with the jail monitors as much likewise with his kindred detainees, however he additionally figures Andy did it essentially to feel typical once more, while watching a film. Andy approaches Red with another strange interest and requests the entertainer Rita Hayworth. Red is amazed by the interest yet consents to submit the request. Yet again as he leaves the theater, Andy experiences the Sisters. Despite the fact that he can convince his direction not to be assaulted, he is severely pummeled to a pulp, placing him in the hospital for a month. Boggs spends 7 days in loan for the beating. At the point when he emerges, he finds Headley and his men holding up in his cell. They beat him so gravely that he's left incapable to walk or eat strong nourishment until the end of his life and is moved to a jail clinic upstate. The Sisters continue on and at no point ever trouble Andy in the future. At the point when Andy escapes the hospital, he tracks down a lot of rocks for him to shape in a monster banner of Rita Hayworth in his cell, presents from Red and his companions. Superintendent Samuel Norton, Bounce Gunton, catches wind of how Andy helped Headley and utilizes an unexpected cell examination to evaluate Andy. He finds Andy perusing his duplicate of the Blessed Book of Scriptures and they discuss their number 1 sections while the gatekeepers are flipping around the cell searching for unlawful belongings. Happy with their experience, the superintendent leaves and nearly neglects to give Andy his book of scriptures back. He then, at that point, urges Andy to continue perusing the book of scriptures, saying that salvation lays inside. Andy is subsequently exhorted that he will currently work in the jail library with maturing prisoner Creek's Hetland, James Whitmore. The justification behind his exchange is made clear when a jail monitor shows up asking Andy for monetary prompting. Andy sets up a shoddy work area and starts working, giving monetary encouraging to most jail watches and assisting them with their personal government forms. Andy likewise sees a valuable chance to extend the jail library. He begins by asking the Maine State Senate for reserves. He composes letters consistently. His monetary help practice is valued to the point that even monitors from different penitentiaries, when they visit for between-jail baseball matches, look for Andy's monetary aptitude. Indeed, even the superintendent himself has Andy setting up his assessment forms. Not long a short time later, Creek snaps and takes steps to kill Haywood to try not to be paroled. Andy can talk him down. At the point when his companions examine Stream's conduct, Red feels for Creek's having clearly become systematized in the wake of expenditure 50 years at Shawshank. He has become basically molded to be a detainee until the end of his life and can't adjust to the rest of the world. Red comments, "These walls are entertaining. First you disdain them, then you become acclimated to them. Enough time elapses, you get so you rely upon them." Creeks is paroled and goes to reside in a shelter. He is likewise given a task at a grocery store which he detests. Tracking down it difficult to conform to life outside the jail, he at last ends it all, leaving the message Streams was here cut on a wooden pillar. Following 6 years of composing letters, Andy gets $200 from the state for the library, alongside an assortment of old books and phonograph records. However, the state senate thinks this will be sufficient to get Andy to stop his letter-composing effort. He is steadfast and tries harder. At the point when the gifts of old books and records show up at the superintendent's office, Andy tracks down a duplicate of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro among the records. He secures the watchman relegated to the superintendent's office in the washroom and plays the record over the jail's DAD framework. The whole jail is before long enthralled by the music. Red comments that the voices of these ladies caused everybody to feel free, if by some stroke of good luck briefly. Outside the workplace, Norton seems enraged at the demonstration of rebellion, and orders Andy to switch in private player. Andy answers by increasing the volume. The superintendent orders Headley to break into the workplace and Andy is sent promptly to isolation for quite some time. At the point when he gets out, he lets his companions know that the stretch was the most straightforward time he could possibly do in the opening since he enjoyed it with Mozart's Figaro latched onto his subconscious mind for solace. At the point when different detainees let him know how far-fetched that is, he discusses the power that trust can have in jail and that trust can support them. Red firmly contradicts Andy, guaranteeing that trust is something perilous in a spot like Shawshank and tells Andy he ought to become acclimated to living without it. Andy infers that this is precisely exact thing Creeks did and Red leaves the table furious. Not long later, Red has another parole hearing and understands he's been in jail for 30 years at this point. He utilizes precisely the same words he utilized decades sooner, just with no excitement by any means. His parole is dismissed once more. Andy gives him a harmonica to celebrate his 30 years, which Red answers by offering Andy a monster banner of Marilyn Monroe to recognize his 10 years. Around 4 years after the Mozart episode, the state senate at last reaches the resolution that they will not dispose of Andy with simply one more check. So they permit him a financial plan of $500 per year to fabricate his library. Andy utilizes it carefully and manages book clubs and good cause to make the best jail library in the state and names it after Streams. With the expanded library and more materials, Andy starts to tutor prisoners who need to accept their secondary school recognitions so they can find a respectable line of work once they're out. In the meantime, Superintendent Norton benefits from Andy's information and devises a plan by which he gives jail detainees something to do on open ventures, which he wins by outbidding different workers for hire. Detainees are modest work. Once in a while, he permits different workers for hire to score projects as long as the payoff is sufficient. Andy launders the cash by setting up a few records in a few banks, alongside a few speculations, utilizing the phony character of Randall Stevens, a man who just exists on papers, made by Andy himself through his insight into the framework and mail-requested structures. Randall Stevens formally has a birth testament, government-managed retirement number and driving permit. Would it be advisable for anybody at any point explore about the plan? They will pursue a man who just exists on paper. Andy imparts the subtleties to Red, noticing that he needed to go to jail to figure out how to be a criminal. In 1965, a youthful detainee named Tommy Gilhulls comes to Shawshank to spend time in jail for breaking and entering. Tommy is nice, charming, and well known among different prisoners and has become a close acquaintance with by both Andy and Red. At the point when Tommy makes sense of that he's been going all through jail since he was 13 years of age, Andy proposes that Tommy ought to consider a different profession other than burglary since he is by all accounts not very great at it. The idea truly gets to Tommy and he requests that Andy assist him with chipping away at procuring his secondary school equivalency recognition. However, Tommy is a decent understudy. He is as yet baffled when he takes the actual test, folding it up and throwing it in the garbage. In any case, Andy recovers it and sends it in. Tommy gets some information about Andy's case which Red makes sense of. After hearing the story, Tommy is apparently disturbed. He then tells Andy and Red the tale of a previous fellow prisoner of his from one more jail who flaunted about killing a man who was a genius golf player at the Nation Club he worked at, alongside his darling. The lady's better half, an investor, had gone to jail for those homicides. With this new data, Andy, confident, meets with the superintendent, anticipating that Norton should assist him with getting another preliminary with Tommy as an observer. The response from Norton is totally in opposition to what Andy expected. At the point when Andy says unequivocally that he could never uncover the tax evasion plans he set up for Norton throughout the long term, the superintendent ends up being incensed and arranges him to single for a month. The detainees talk about the sentence referencing the most significant length of time in single they've known about. They likewise understand that Andy may really be blameless all things considered and has spent very nearly 20 years in jail for a wrongdoing he didn't perpetrate. Tommy gets a letter from the leading body of instruction declaring that he has finished the test and presently possesses a secondary school confirmation. A watchman passed the news to Andy in his single cell which makes him grin a bit. Later on, Tommy is accompanied outside around evening time to have a confidential gathering with the superintendent. Superintendent Norton inquires as to whether the story he told Andy is valid and in the event that he might want to affirm for Andy's sake. Tommy eagerly concurs. The superintendent grins at him prior to gesturing to Headley to shoot him dead. At the point when the superintendent visits Andy in singular, he lets him know that Tommy attempted to escape and that Headley had no real option except to shoot him. Andy doesn't buy that story and lets Norton know that everything stops and that he won't work for him any longer. The superintendent undermines Andy to close down the library, consume every one of the books, and move Andy to a very different cell in an entirely different piece of the jail with the most solidified crooks. Would it be a good idea for him he quit working for him? He then, at that point, passes on and orders Andy to one more month in singular to contemplate things. At the point when Andy at long last emerges from single, he and Red have a discussion where Andy discusses his better half and the amount he cherished her and feels liable for her passing despite the fact that he didn't pull the trigger. He then discusses his tasks. Would it be a good idea for him he at any point escape jail? He discusses Zihuatanejo, an oceanside town on the Pacific shoreline of Mexico where he might want to reside until the end of his life and deal with the lodging there. He then inquires as to whether he'd go along with him, to which Red says no and that he accepts he is excessively far gone like streams. He then, at that point, censures Andy for permitting desire to play with his psyche like that and that it will just annihilate him. Andy concurs and is going to leave when he inquires as to whether he knows the Buxton, Maine region. He then, at that point, educates Red regarding a quite certain grassland where there is a huge oak tree toward the finish of a stone wall. He then requests that Red commitment him that, would it be a good idea for him he at any point get paroled, he will look for that oak tree and recover something tucked away among the stones, however won't get out whatever it is. Red commitments however is stressed over his companion's perspective. His concerns are uplifted further when he discovers that Andy has asked Haywood for a 6-foot rope. Red accepts Andy might have at last arrived at his limit and is going to end it all. In the meantime, Norton requests that Andy sparkle his shoes for himself and put his suit in for dry cleaning prior to turning in. Andy gets back to his cell and the watchman switch the lights out for the evening. Red comments that it was the longest evening of his life. The next morning, Andy has not addressed the morning call and isn't remaining before his phone like each day. The watchman hollers at Andy for putting him late and strolls to his cell hoping to track down a genuinely wiped out or dead Andy. Simultaneously, Norton becomes frightened when he finds Andy's shoes in his shoebox rather than his own. The caution then, at that point, goes off reporting a missing detainee. Norton hurries to Andy's vacant cell and requests a clarification. Hadley acquires Red, however Red demands he remains unaware of Andy's arrangements. Turning out to be progressively antagonistic and suspicious, Norton begins tossing Andy's etched rocks around the cell. At the point when he tosses one at Andy's banner of Raquel Welch, in the spot recently involved by Marilyn Monroe, and before that by Rita Hayworth, the stone punches through and into the wall. Norton tears the banner from the wall, uncovering a passage sufficiently wide for a man to slither into. It is uncovered in a progression of flashback successions described by Red that quite a while back, not long subsequent to accepting his stone sledge, Andy honestly attempted to cut his name on his cell wall when a lump of it fell off. Andy, loved geography, understood that the material the wall was made off of could make it workable for him to dig an opening on the off chance that he at any point expected to escape. Andy originally requested the monster banner of Rita Hayworth to conceal the opening. He then, at that point, went through years digging around evening time with his stone mallet and concealing the soil from his occupation into his pockets, which he would then discharge in the patio during his morning strolls. At the point when Tommy was killed, Andy concluded the time had come to go. During the earlier night's rainstorm, Andy wore Norton's garments under his own to his phone, getting a big chance when nobody sees Norton's sparkly dark shoes on his feet, including Red. He stuffed large numbers of his possessions, a few papers and Norton's garments into a plastic sack which he attached to himself with the rope he'd requested, and got away from through his opening. The passage he'd uncovered driven him to a space between two walls of the jail where he tracked down a sewer principal line. Utilizing a stone, he hit the sewer line in time a few times with the lightning strikes and ultimately tore it open. In the wake of slithering through 500 yards of the crude sewage contained in the line, Andy arose in a creek outside the walls. A hunt group later found his jail garments, a bar of cleanser and an exceptionally broken-down rock hammer. While the superintendent and Red are finding Andy's virtuoso getaway, Andy strolls into the main public bank in Portland, where he had put Norton's cash. Involving his expected way of life as Randall Stevens, and with all the fundamental documentation, he finishes the record and wanders off with the clerk's check. Before he leaves, he requests that they drop a bundle via the post office. He proceeds with his appearances to almost 12 other nearby banks, winding up with some $370,000. The bundle contains Superintendent Norton's bookkeeping books, which are conveyed directly to the Portland Everyday Trumpet paper alongside Andy's composed admissions and declaration. Not long later, the Maine State Police stormed Shawshank Jail alongside a few columnists to cover the creating story. Hadley is captured for the homicide of Tommy and is removed by the state police. As per Red, he heard unwarranted bits of gossip unofficially that Hadley purportedly began crying like a young lady in the secondary lounge of the police crew vehicle while he was being removed. Seeing Hadley being removed in a police crew vehicle and the nearby lead prosecutor entering the jail with a few cops holding a warrant for Norton's capture, Superintendent Norton at long last opens his protected in his office, which he hadn't contacted since Andy gotten away, and on second thought of his books, he finds the book of scriptures he had given Andy with a note to the superintendent saying that he was correct. Salvation did lay inside. Norton then opens it to the book of mass migration and finds that the pages had all been removed, looking like Andy's stone mallet. Norton strolls back to his work area as the police beat on his entryway, takes out a little pistol and ends it all by shooting himself in the head. Red comments that he contemplated whether the superintendent thought, just prior to pulling the trigger, how Andy might at any point have defeated him. Soon after, Red gets a postcard from Stronghold, Hancock, Texas, with nothing composed on it. Red accepts it as a sign that Andy made it into Mexico to opportunity. Red and his mates kill time discussing Andy's endeavors, with a couple of embellishments. However, Red falls into a kind of sadness from missing his companion. At Red's next parole hearing in 1967, he converses with the parole board about how restored is only a made-up word imagined to legitimize their work. He then makes sense of the amount he laments his activities of the past, not on the grounds that he's in prison but since he realizes how wrong it was. He then closes by saying that he needs to live with that until the end of his life and request that the load up quit burning through his time and let him be. His parole is at last conceded. He goes to reside in the very puts that Creeks did. In any event, seeing Stream's message cut into the wooden pillar, he regularly strolls by a pawn shop which has a few weapons in the window. Now and again he examines attempting to get once more into jail, feeling that he has no life beyond jail where he has burned through the majority of his grown-up life. However, he recalls the commitment he made to Andy. He then, at that point, uncovers that he was not taking a gander at the weapons but rather at the compasses behind the firearms, and he got one. Red adheres to Andy's guidelines, catching a ride to Buxton and finding the stone wall Andy portrayed. Similarly, as Andy said, there is a huge dark stone. Under is a little box containing an enormous amount of money and directions to come track down him in Zahuatanijo, despite the fact that he doesn't name the city for good measure. He likewise says he wants someone who can get things for a project of his. Red unexpectedly sees all the force of trust and feels elated by the sentiments within him. Subsequent to cutting another message in the wooden pillar which peruses, "Streams was here, so was Red." Red disregards parole and goes out, uninterested since nobody is probably going to do a broad manhunt for an old lawbreaker like him. Red takes a transport to Stronghold Hancock, where he crosses into Mexico. The two companions are at last rejoined on an ocean side of the Pacific coast, very much like Andy had been expecting. Thanks for watching, please subscribe and like.